Without further ado, I'm going to give you our author and presenter, Jim Gregory.
Another tragedy involved our Chinatown, the Lewis store there. Lewis's wife, an extraordinary woman, Gan Ying, isn't she beautiful? It means silver dove. Lewis was 48, she was 20 when they were married in San Francisco. Brought her back to San Luis Obispo. They lived in the apartments above the store. As far as we know, she only left the store twice during the next 20 years. I don't know what one occasion was, the other one that she needed to go to the dentist. She would raise a family of remarkable children in that confined space. And in September of 1909, she was found shot to death. A bullet hole midway between her cheekbone and temple, her face to the wall, lying in her bed, and that's her baby boy, Howard, who is lying in the bed next to her. My favorite Howard anecdote, he was the youngest of the children. He says, I was 22 before I learned there was any other part to the chicken other than the neck, because he was the baby, right? Okay, all the older kids got the better pieces, and by the time Howard got the chicken, only the neck was left. So. But he was a toddler asleep next to his mother when she was shot to death. And the man who broke the case, he was in San Miguel at the time, jumped into a buggy he thought was his. It turned out not to be. He was going down the main drag of San Miguel with a citizen running after him, screaming, "Stop the thief." Yancey McFadden was very embarrassed, but he stopped the buggy, got another one, and came down to San Luis Obispo and convened a coroner's jury, which met in very confined spaces upstairs of the Lewis store. McFadden was a remarkable sheriff. He was raised in Paso Robles, obviously was Irish-American with that name. You may remember there was for a short time a bar and disco where San Luis Obispo, where Channel 6 is today, called Yancey McFadden. So he looked, reminded me, thanks in part to his girth as well, of the sheriff played by Burl Ives in East of Eden with James Dean. Okay, that kind of sheriff. He started asking questions. And as was customary among the Chinese, Gan Ying's body would be repatriated to China for burial. So her coffin was put on a train. She was accompanied by her stepson, Willie Lewis, up to San Francisco, who would arrange for transportation back home. And Yancey McFadden followed Willie Lewis. He got a warrant, arrested him, and brought him back to San Luis Obispo, charged him with murder. Willie would have been kept in the basement of the old county courthouse. This is the county courthouse that Alex Madonna single-handedly demolished in 1939, the real beginning of Madonna Construction Company. And he would confess to the killing. He would say there had been years of bad blood between himself and his stepmother. She was constantly reminding him that he would not inherit, that her children would. He didn't improve matters with his stepmother by offering living space to a live-in prostitute behind the Lewis store. That didn't endear him to her at all. The trial lasted 4 days. It was very easy to arrive at the guilty verdict. The difficult part was the penalty phase. There was vociferous and adamant opposition to the death penalty in California in 1909. There were a series of bills that failed either in the Assembly or the Senate to abolish the death penalty. It took the jury 7 ballots to finally agree to send Willie Lewis to the executioner. Unfortunately for Willie, that phase of the trial was on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. The jury wanted to go home. So 3 years later, that's his San Quentin booking photo, Willie Lewis would be hanged. Believe it or not, the teens were relatively sedate. We had a brief calm period, relatively, and then this happened. And look at the impact. I love this photograph. This is a photograph of the San Luis Obispo Police Department about 1930. Note what the officer on the right is carrying, a Thompson submachine gun. Okay, that was a matter of police forces finally starting to catch up to gangsters like those in Chicago in terms of firepower. But our 20s were definitely roaring. This little girl, Eleanor Walling, was a child prodigy violinist. She played in concert at, wait for it, the Lompoc Opera House, where her father was the impresario, owner, manager. She acted in the plays that her father wrote. They formed a dance band and played at an Avila Beach roadhouse. Eventually, Eleanor will go away. It is said she went away to try her luck on the vaudeville circuit. That's not exactly what happened. When Eleanor reappears in 1924, it's with a revolver in her hand, and she and two men are robbing the Taft State Bank just over the county line. She fired a pistol shot into the ceiling in the process. They stole $5,700, which is about $80,000 today, and they were caught. And Eleanor offered to turn state's evidence, and she continued to play the violin in the Kern County Jail, where all the guards were infatuated with her. She wore her hair cut short, as was the fashion, so she became known as the bobbed-haired bandit. She charmed the jury, she charmed the courtroom when she testified. All innocence didn't make any difference. I learned something new. That's why I write books. You learn new stuff. She was sent to San Quentin. I didn't know women went to San Quentin. They did. The bob-haired bandit did. She went to San Quentin, where her cellmate had a nickname too. It was Clara the Hammer, after her murder weapon of choice. Clara thought her husband had taken a lover. So she did what many women in that situation do. She went to the hardware store. And she was hefting a hammer when the clerk came to help her, and she said to the clerk, "Sir, do you think this is heavy enough to kill a woman?" And he said, "Well, yes, ma'am, I guess it is." And he was right. So they were in San Quentin together. Eventually, Eleanor will be paroled. She'll live in San Francisco in a hotel. The census lists her occupation as musician. But there were a series of holdups in the East Bay and in the city of banks and drugstores. And it was two women dressed as men, which is exactly the way Eleanor was dressed the day she robbed the Taft State Bank. They never was able to, they questioned her, but they were never able to pin any of the robberies on her. This, of course, is Al Capone in Pismo Beach from Effie McDermott's book. A shooting pool at the Waldorf Inn, which is today a Cool Cat Cafe on Pomeroy. He came to visit California, was quickly ushered back to Chicago when LAPD Chief Jim Davis found out he was here. But I found a column by an old-time Chicago newspaper man about Capone, and he said that the Central Coast of California was one of his favorite spots for smuggling liquor ashore. And then I met a friend of mine who was 5 years old at the time of Prohibition, and he said, "Yeah, Dad, whenever they went on a hunting trip, they took their guns and whiskey," which I don't think is a good combination, but that's just my opinion, "and they would go to Shell Beach to buy their booze from a dealer there who'd gotten it from boats offshore, just like the boats we have for marijuana smugglers today." And they took me along. I was 5. And I asked him, "Bill, why did they take you along?" He said, "Well, they figured the sheriff would never ask anybody with a 5-year-old kid what they were doing at that particular spot on the beach." And that he was right. They never did get busted. My grandmother worked as a waitress in a cafe in Taft. And when people asked for extra sugar, it meant they got a good dollop of Canadian whiskey in their coffee. Grandma Kelly, God bless her. The fact that she was married to a sergeant of police pretty much protected her. She never got in any trouble for that. This is Jess Lowry, and he is the county sheriff who in 1928 pulled this truck over in Pismo Beach. He started moving the lumber load on top of the truck, and underneath there are 200 jerry cans full of Canadian whiskey. It was the biggest bust of Jess Lowry's career as sheriff. And unlike a previous sheriff, he was actually able to hang on to the evidence. There was another bust earlier in the 1920s where the evidence mysteriously disappeared from the bullpen in the sheriff's office, and they never did find out what happened to it. The last big bust in county history before the repeal of Prohibition was of a small-time gangster named Pico Canero, who was arrested. There were several running gun battles in the North County of Cayucas and San Simeon. Pico was arrested near Cayucas, and Pico is not that important. His big brother was, Tony Canero, was a bootlegger, a big-time bootlegger in Los Angeles, but he's more famous for what he did after Prohibition ended. And he owned a series of gambling ships, like the Rex there, that was anchored outside Santa Monica just beyond the 3-mile limit. And the boat in the foreground is chock full of IRS agents about to raid the Rex. And can you see the guy with the hose? The next series of photographs, they're turning a high-pressure fire hose loose on the revenue agents. So, Tony, by the way, would either die of a heart attack or Lucky Luciano, depending on the version of the story. He may have been poisoned. And he had one of the first casinos in Las Vegas, which burned down either because of an electrical problem or Lucky Luciano. So this was an extraordinary place, and I cannot tell you how much fun it was to research and write that book. It was a great joy. And I'm not done yet because I have a hard time shutting up. I've got another book coming out, hopefully Memorial Day, about Central Coast combat aviators. We lost 18 young men during World War II, either in training accidents or in combat. And we have, that young woman was a WASP pilot, and she's 99 years old, and she lives in Los Osos. Her job was to test flight AT-6 trainers that had just come out of the shop, on the supposition it was okay for a woman to crash, but not necessarily an air cadet. When a woman did die, the Army refused to cover burial expenses. And the girls, as they called themselves in the 1940s, would take up a collection and designate one of them to accompany the body home. About 5 years ago, a WASP pilot family requested that she be buried in Arlington, and the Secretary of the Army refused. It took a special act of Congress to give that woman what was rightfully hers. So the story of the WASP pilots is absolutely extraordinary. And I want to end with Al Spierling, who was auto shop teacher for many, many years at Arroyo Grande High School. Kids loved Al Spierling. He was a straight shooter. He loved engines. And he was able to communicate that passion onto kids. And he was a flight engineer on a B-17 in August of 1944 during a mission over Berlin. And if you notice the tail fin, that's the Georgia Peach. That was their assigned airplane that day. And Al's position as a flight engineer and top turret gunner was right on top, in that blister on top of the airplane. What happened is the B-17 above them in the formation hit a prop wash and dropped like a stone. And Al looked up and he said later, "I could count the rivets in the bomb bay doors as I prepared to die." Well, somehow the Georgia Peach managed to keep going, dropped her bomb load on the designated target in Berlin, and on the way back home to their air base in Britain, she was hit by flak. And the flak burst severed the throttle cables on the number 1 and number 2 engines. So Georgia Peach went from 25,000 feet over Berlin to about 1,000 feet over the English Channel, and that's when the pilot finally panicked and said, Al was the flight engineer, he said, "Al, for God's sake, get me some power." So Spierling, the flak burst had just missed Spierling, crawled down into the hole, crawled under the seats of the pilot and co-pilot, and he found in that compartment the severed ends of the 2 throttle cables. And I have a mental picture of him kind of shrugging. He yanked on them, and the engine started. He said, "When we landed, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the cellophane off my pack of cigarettes." He was an extraordinary man. He would be the founder of Arroyo Grande, my alma mater, and the place where I taught for 19 years, the founder of our excellent vocational education program. Just an extraordinary man. and courageous beyond measure, because not only did he survive this, he was also the district's driver training teacher for many years. So Al Spierling, my hat is off to you, sir. There he is, 22 years old. Thank you for having me tonight. Do you have any questions? If there are any questions you'd like to ask me, I may or may not know the answer. Yes, sir.
The Reeds involved in the massacre in Miguel, were they related to or themselves the Reeds and the Donner Party?
No, they were all, it's just a strange confluence. They were all strangers to each other. The nucleus was a pair of men who met, the real ringleader had started by stabbing a man to death at Sutter's Mill, and was confined to the jail cell in Sutter's Fort. He escaped. He joined up with another guy. They rode across the San Joaquin Valley toward the coast, and they took up with two other men who were gold miners. They killed them, and they arrived at Mission Soledad, where the three ship jumpers and a Native American named Juan were just kind of hanging out, idling their time away. And then they joined up and headed south for the mission. When they got there, it was very spontaneous. They left on the morning after they had spent the night the first time, and they only got about a mile down El Camino Real before they decided to turn around and come back for the gold. Right. Wow. Yeah.
Ward's father was a man named James Ward, who was reputed, as never been established conclusively, to be the morganatic son of King George IV. Morganatic means King George IV had married a Catholic woman,
Right.
and secretly.
Wow.
When the secret came out, the marriage was annulled. It introduced two children, one of which was James, supposedly, and they farmed him out to an order of Catholic priests in Maryland. He was a priest, but he didn't want to be, went to West Point, and his son was Edward O.C.
Okay. And Edward O.C. would play he was a commander of the Army of the James during the Appomattox campaign, and would play a very key role in bringing the Civil War to an end. But that's an incredible story. Yeah.
I have to say that a number of people are trying to research that, and George, the future George IV, if you remember the movie The
Madness of King George.
He marries without his permission to Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was not only Catholic but a divorced woman, and there is a child produced. But the likelihood that it was related to Edward Elko Crescent Ward is unfortunately more myth than it is reality, and we're so, because the family, three generals came out of that family.
Wow.
And just a marvelous military career. Ord himself was the first surveyor of the city of Los Angeles, and his assistant was William Rich Hutton, who came to this county and did the first survey of the city of San Luis Obispo,
Incredible.
the Dana Ranch, the Santa Manuela Ranch, and so on.
Okay.
There are a lot of wonderful connections. And I believe Ord is also connected to the murder of Sutter's Mill, and I don't remember the exact connection.
The perpetrator, who was later in Peter Raymond, I think his name was drunk and being noisy, and a miner, I believe he was German, took it on himself to try to quiet him down so they could sleep. And Raymond pulled his Bowie knife from the man's belt and stabbed him to death with it. And that would be the first of many killings. So Raymond was one who eventually tried to swim out to sea at Summerlin and didn't make it. So real survivors. Yes, sir.
Jim, suppose your favorite outlaw, Dick Fellows, has any relation to Chuck Fellows or
You know, I've always wondered about Chuck Fellows, but
He's sitting in the front row.
that's right. I'm sure that Chuck is a superb horseman. So. Yes, sir.
What were the 5 streets in San Luis named after?
Oh boy, BB was one. Murray, obviously. It's in the book. I can't grab them right now. Yeah, but they were all members of the executive committee, which was the final body that assessed sentence, the death penalty. Yeah. And 5 of the hangings occurred out here. One of them occurred on the street between here and the San Luis Obispo County Historical Museum. And that perpetrator was apprehended in Los Angeles and brought to San Luis Obispo by Romulo Pacheco, who would be the first and only Latino governor of California, and was good friends with Walter Murray. Okay.
Can we bring you back to talk about each of your other books?
Well, sure. I have to say the World War II book and the Flyers book were very difficult because you have the eerie sensation. I have 2 boys in their 20s. So when you're researching the young Marine who was just brought back to Arroyo Grande, who was killed on Tarwa, when you get to know these young men, even though they're of my father's generation, they become almost like your sons. I remember reading a hilarious letter from a Filipino-American who was a mess steward. That was the only rating that Filipinos could aspire to in the World War II Navy. A mess steward on a destroyer. He's in the World War II book. And just a funny letter written to his foreman back at the Walter Seed Company in the Rio Grande Valley. And you just thought, man, if I was in the Navy, I would want this guy to be on my ship with me because he's got a great sense of humor. And then about 3 hours later, I read that he had been killed off Guadalcanal. And it was literally like getting hit in the stomach. So this book was substantially different from that. It was great fun. So,
That'll be out on Memorial Day.
yeah, the Flyers book will be out at Memorial Day, and that book was just extraordinary as well. Just the courage. The biggest enemy wasn't the Germans or the Japanese; it was fear, and they had to overcome that. And they were so young. You know, there were plenty of gunners who were 16, 17 years old. The average age of a B-17 pilot was 22. So, you know, it's incredible. Once again, an incredible generation. Yes, ma'am.
Are your books available online?
Yeah, they're available on Amazon.com. And the History Press books, the second book, I published myself, but the Rio Grande book and the Outlaws book will also be at Barnes & Noble as well. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. It was a delight.